In the bloody spring of 1285, the supposedly impenetrable heart of Dai Viet faced utter annihilation. Prince Togon commanded his invincible vanguard to ruthlessly storm the royal capital, expecting glorious plunder and absolute surrender. But instead of a trembling populace, the conquerors were greeted by a suffocating, terrifying wall of roaring flames. The ultimate prize of the Mongol Empire had been intentionally turned into a massive, burning graveyard of ash. Every single granary was empty, every well filled with dirt, leaving a terrifying void for the hungry invaders.
They burned their own throne! Find them! I want this entire country reduced to bloody ash!
Miles downstream, safely hidden by the labyrinthine waterways, the true soul of Dai Viet remained perfectly intact. The young emperor watched his burning capital fade into the horizon, bearing the agonizing weight of necessary sacrifice.
Let them claim the ashes. We keep the soul of our nation alive in these waters.
Beside him stood the master architect of this grand deception, orchestrating the survival of an entire civilization. The Supreme Commander had already anticipated the enemy's blind rage, weaving a deadly trap within the muddy currents. Back in the scorched capital, the brutal reality of sustaining 500,000 men quickly began to sink in. The relentless tropical sun baked their heavy iron armor, turning their protective gear into suffocating, torturous ovens. Dehydration struck like a silent assassin, systematically crippling the most feared military machine in the world. Tens of thousands of elite warhorses, the absolute backbone of the steppe army, began to wither without pasture. Soon, deadly camp fevers erupted, sweeping mercilessly through the densely packed ranks of the exhausted northern invaders. Enraged and terrified by this invisible enemy, the Mongol prince demanded immediate action to salvage his collapsing campaign.
Launch the armada! Trap them in the delta before this cursed heat kills us all!
A colossal armada of heavy, towering Yuan vessels arrogantly pushed into the treacherous, shifting currents of the delta. They had no idea they were sailing directly into the gaping jaws of a perfectly orchestrated, fiery death trap. Deep within the suffocating heat of the winding delta, the massive Mongol fleet struggled to maintain any coherent formation. The heavy, deep-draft vessels designed for massive rivers were completely useless in these shallow, unpredictable, and shifting mud channels. An eerie, terrifying silence hung over the dense jungle banks, broken only by the frantic splashing of trapped oars. The psychological pressure became absolute torture as the exhausted steppe warriors stared into the dark, impenetrable walls of green. Suddenly, a single sharp whistling sound pierced the humid air, instantly shattering the unbearable, nerve-wracking tropical silence. That single spark was the ultimate command, unleashing a devastating storm of fire from the seemingly empty jungle banks. The heavily armored invaders had absolutely nowhere to run, as their massive wooden transport ships quickly became floating infernos. Realizing the catastrophic trap, the furious vanguard captain desperately ordered his men to abandon the rapidly sinking, burning vessels.
Abandon the ships! Get to the muddy banks, or burn with this cursed wooden fleet!
From their incredibly fast and agile rowboats, the Dai Viet guerrillas moved like deadly phantoms through the chaotic smoke. Supreme Commander Trần Hưng Đạo watched the blazing gauntlet from a safe distance, his trap executing with absolute, flawless precision. He had brilliantly turned the enemy's overwhelming size into their greatest weakness, using the land itself as a weapon. Far away in the desolate encampment, Prince Togon received the catastrophic news of his annihilated river fleet. Trapped in a starving, fever-ridden wasteland, the once arrogant conqueror finally felt the terrifying grip of absolute desperation.
Half my fleet turned to ash! This jungle is swallowing my invincible army alive!
Meanwhile, safely hidden within a secret marshland fortress, the Dai Viet command established their temporary royal headquarters. The young emperor finally stepped onto solid ground, his heart heavy but his resolve forged into unbreakable steel. They had successfully bled the northern beast, but the war for absolute national survival was far from its final conclusion. Just as the royal court began to strategize their next massive counteroffensive, a sudden commotion erupted at the fortress gates. The frantic rider collapsed violently onto the wooden floor, desperately clutching an item of terrifying, unimaginable importance. The breathless messenger presented the cursed artifact, his voice trembling as he delivered the catastrophic news from the south. A second monstrous Yuan army, commanded by the notoriously ruthless veteran, had completely shattered the southern defensive lines. This legendary conqueror was rapidly marching northward, aiming to crush the fragile Dai Viet resistance in an inescapable vice.
Toron in the north, Sogetu in the south. The massive jaws of the beast are closing around us.
Despite the terrifying revelation, the Supreme Commander remained an unshakable pillar of absolute, cold, and calculating strategic resolve. He knew that dividing their heavily outnumbered forces was suicide, so they had to let the northern invaders rot first. The brutal strategy of agonizing attrition would continue to systematically dismantle the arrogant northern prince's massive, trapped army. Inside the sweltering wasteland, the grand illusion of Mongol supremacy was rapidly crumbling into dust, heat, and absolute despair. Severe rationing had turned once fiercely loyal soldiers into desperate, starving men, violently fighting over completely rotten scraps. The prince's desperate foraging parties constantly returned empty-handed, finding absolutely nothing but scorched earth and deliberately poisoned wells.
There is no food, no clean water. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting the cursed earth itself.
Furthermore, the dense, suffocatingly humid jungle environment quickly became a massive, inescapable breeding ground for deadly tropical diseases. Malaria and dysentery swept through the densely packed tents like an invisible, unstoppable scythe, silently claiming thousands of lives daily. The sheer volume of the severely sick and dying completely overwhelmed the massive invaders' primitive and unprepared medical capabilities. Even the legendary war horses, the terrifying, unstoppable engine of the Mongol conquests, were dropped dead by the thousands. The Supreme Conqueror watched his seemingly invincible empire slowly dissolve into a catastrophic, humiliating, and inescapable tropical nightmare.
I will never be defeated by swamps and fever. Prepare all remaining legions for a massive, full frontal assault.
He aggressively demanded an immediate, massive offensive, ruthlessly pushing his starving troops far beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. This desperate, completely blind aggression was exactly the fatal, monumental mistake the grand strategist of Dai Viet was calmly waiting for. The massive trap of exhaustion was fully set, and the critical time for the invisible shadows to aggressively strike back was rapidly approaching. The massive, exhausted northern war machine began its torturous, incredibly slow march through the flooded, entirely hostile terrain. Every single step through the thick tropical mud drained the last remaining drops of energy from the starving invaders. They marched completely blind, utterly unaware that the surrounding dense foliage hid thousands of perfectly camouflaged, silent executioners. Suddenly, a terrifying barrage of deadly projectiles rained down from the impenetrable tree line, instantly shattering their massive formation.
Shield wall! Form the line! Find where they are shooting from before we all die in this mud!
But as quickly as they struck, the phantom warriors completely vanished back into the deep, impenetrable tropical shadows. This relentless, agonizing hit-and-run warfare slowly drove the once arrogant steppe conquerors into a state of absolute paranoia. When the dark, terrifying night fell, the agonizing psychological torture escalated with the constant, deafening roar of war drums. Sleep deprivation became the ultimate weapon, completely destroying the mental fortitude of the heavily armed northern invaders. Inside his grand tent, the furious prince violently realized his massive army was being systematically bled to death.
March to the delta! Burn every single patch of jungle until we find their cursed hidden fortress!
The massive, incredibly desperate northern horde finally turned their agonizing march toward the labyrinthine waters of the massive delta. Deep inside his secret marshland fortress, the brilliant Supreme Commander watched the massive enemy make their final fatal maneuver. The timing was absolutely perfect. The enemy was incredibly weak, severely disorganized, and blindly walking right into the kill zone. As the massive Mongol vanguard aggressively approached the riverbanks, the solid ground rapidly turned into an inescapable, terrifying swamp. The terrifying Mongol heavy cavalry, the absolute pride of the empire, was completely paralyzed in the incredibly deep mud.
They are completely trapped in the mud! Unleash the fire, and let the river swallow them whole!
A colossal, incredibly dark storm of armor-piercing arrows completely blotted out the blinding tropical sun. The sheer impact of the massive ambush caused the incredibly dense enemy formations to instantly and completely collapse inward. There was absolutely no escape from the muddy death trap. The Grand Empire's invincible vanguard was being utterly dismantled. The merciless barrage of fiery projectiles quickly turned the muddy battlefield into an inescapable blazing inferno. Desperate to break the deadly encirclement, the heavy river cavalry attempted a violent frontal charge through the thick swamp. But their brute strength was completely useless against the highly mobile, perfectly synchronized guerrilla defense. The incredibly swift Dai Viet boats darted out from the dense foliage, unleashing massive volleys at point-blank range. The arrogant northern prince watched from his distant command ship as his elite forces were systematically annihilated.
Hold the line! Any man who takes a single step backward will be executed by my own sword!
However, raw terror had completely shattered the famously unbreakable discipline of the massive steppe army. Entire battalions of heavy infantry violently turned on each other, desperately fighting for the few remaining retreat paths. Standing victorious upon his flagship, the Supreme Commander coldly observed the complete destruction of the invaders' vanguard. He had masterfully transformed the treacherous, muddy currents of his homeland into the ultimate weapon of mass destruction.
Let these burning ships carry our absolute answer back to their emperor! Dai Viet will never kneel!
Yet even amidst this monumental triumph, the seasoned general remained incredibly vigilant against the looming southern threat. He urgently ordered the royal fleet to securely transport the young emperor deeper into the impenetrable jungle fortress. Back on the blackened, muddy shores, the completely humiliated northern prince orchestrated a desperate, incredibly chaotic retreat. The massive invasion force that had confidently marched into the capital was now a severely crippled, starving remnant. Their grand illusion of absolute invincibility was permanently shattered by the brilliant, unforgiving, scorched earth strategy. Meanwhile, the young emperor safely reached the hidden command center, carrying the heavy burden of the next phase. He immediately summoned his elite tactical council to address the catastrophic, rapidly advancing southern invasion force. The ruthless veteran general tearing through the southern borders was a far deadlier, more experienced threat than the arrogant prince. The survival of the entire civilization now completely depended on escaping this monumental, inescapable two-front strangulation. The southern warlord was rapidly tearing through the coastal defenses with absolute, terrifying military efficiency. His battle-hardened veterans easily overwhelmed the thin southern garrisons, leaving a colossal trail of structural destruction. Inside the hidden command center, the brilliant Supreme Commander coldly analyzed this devastating, massive dual threat.
If Toron and Sogetu join their massive forces, Dai Viet will be crushed entirely. We must sever their connection.
Immediately, hundreds of incredibly fast royal couriers were dispatched into the dark, heavily flooded jungle networks. Their critical orders were to aggressively stall the southern warlord using absolute, relentless guerrilla attrition tactics. Meanwhile, the humiliated northern prince desperately attempted to regroup his starving, severely decimated forces. The suffocating heat and rampant disease continued to relentlessly massacre his once completely invincible steppe warriors. However, a sudden, desperate glimmer of terrifying hope arrived when scouts reported the southern army's advance.
Hold your ground! Sogetu is coming! When our massive forces unite, we will burn this jungle to ash!
The grand strategic board was now perfectly set for a catastrophic, absolutely monumental clash of empires. The young emperor stood before his massively outnumbered, heavily fortified elite troops, preparing for the ultimate sacrifice.
We are surrounded by wolves, but we are the absolute masters of these lands. fight for eternal survival!
The thunderous roar of the massive Dai Viet army echoed powerfully through the dense, flooded valleys. Far to the south, the ruthless warlord continued his incredibly brutal, extremely rapid northward march. He arrogantly dismissed the deadly jungle terrain, relying entirely on his massive, overwhelmingly superior numbers. But the brilliant Supreme Commander had already transformed the entire southern route into a massive, hidden graveyard. Massive, devastating traps and relentless, highly coordinated ambushes began to violently stall the arrogant southern conqueror. As massive black smoke violently choked the southern skies, the terrifying pincer movement tightened its deadly grip.
March forward!
Despite the devastating firestorm, the massive southern horde continued their relentless, seemingly unstoppable march toward the capital. The sheer, terrifying momentum of the veteran warlord threatened to completely undo the brilliant victory achieved in the north. Back in the desolate northern wasteland, the arrogant prince received the desperately awaited, highly critical tactical dispatch.
Sogetu has broken their lines! Sharpen your blades! We march to crush them between our massive armies!
The colossal jaws of the Mongol war machine were finally, terrifyingly aligning to snap completely shut. Inside the hidden marshland fortress, the heavy burden of absolute national survival weighed heavily upon the young ruler. He deeply understood that any conventional, massive confrontation against this coordinated dual assault meant absolute, total erasure. The Supreme Commander approached, his dark armor completely soaked, carrying the ultimate, highly dangerous tactical proposition.
We cannot fight both monsters simultaneously. We must completely abandon this fortress and divide their massive forces.
The shocking proposition to abandon another heavily fortified base tested the absolute limits of the royal court's resolve. But the young emperor, completely trusting his brilliant strategist, firmly authorized the incredibly dangerous, massive tactical retreat. Instantly, the massive, highly organized evacuation protocol was fiercely initiated under the cloak of the relentless storm. They were willfully stepping back into the incredibly treacherous, massive unknown, risking absolutely everything on a grand gamble. As the completely empty fortress faded into the darkness, the massive, terrifying armies of the north and south finally converged. The absolute greatest, most devastating chase in the history of the massive empire had just officially begun.